The wind in this part of the territory did not merely blow, it scoured. It came screaming down from the jagged red spines of the distant bluffs, carrying a payload of grit that could strip the paint off a wagon wheel or the hope out of a man in less than a season. It was a relentless, invisible hand that sanded the world down to its bones. Caleb Vance pushed his hat lower against the assault, squinting until his eyes were nothing more than dark slits in a face weathered like old saddle leather. He sat atop his mare, a roan with a coat the color of dried blood, and watched the gray ocean of sagebrush undulate under the morning sun. It was early, barely an hour past dawn, but the heat was already rising, shimmering in oily waves off the hardpan. This was the high desert, a place that God seemed to have made in anger and then forgotten entirely. It was a land of silence and spines, where everything that grew had thorns and everything that breathed had to fight for the privilege. Caleb owned 3,000 acres of this dust, a claim that looked impressive on a surveyor's map in the land office, but felt like a prison sentence when viewed from the back of a horse in the middle of a drought. He shifted in the saddle, the leather creaking in the stillness. His lower back ached, a dull, thumping reminder of a fall he had taken 2 winters ago, or perhaps just the accumulated weight of 40 years of living hard. He was a man built of sharp angles and slow movements, with hands that were scarred from barbed wire and rope, and eyes that had seen too much of the worst parts of men. The ranch, if one could call it that, lay 5 miles behind him, a cluster of sun-bleached timber huddled in the lee of a rocky outcrop. He lived there alone, unless one counted the ghosts. They were not the kind that rattled chains in the attic, but the kind that lived in the quiet spaces between heartbeats. They were the memories of the Indian Wars, of the uniform he had worn, and the orders he had followed until the day he simply could not follow them anymore. He nudged the mare forward. The storm last night had been a violent one, a dry electrical temper tantrum that had shaken the cabin walls and terrified the stock. He needed to check the fence line. In this country, a broken fence meant scattered cattle, and scattered cattle meant death, by thirst, by wolf, or by the wandering thieves who drifted through the territory like tumbleweeds. The work was monotonous. He dismounted at a section where the wind had snapped a cedar post clean at the base. The wood was dry-rotted, hollowed out by termites. He cursed softly, the sound swallowed instantly by the vastness around him. He worked with the efficiency of a man who had done this task 1,000 times. He used the wire stretchers to pull the slack taut, the metal singing a high, dangerous note, and drove new staples into the replacement post he had dragged from the saddle. Sweat dripped from his nose, turning the dust on his boots to mud. He paused to drink from his canteen, the water warm and tasting of tin. He looked south, toward the town that lay 15 miles away. He rarely went there. The town was a festering sore of tension, filled with men who had failed elsewhere and come here to take their bitterness out on the land, or anyone with darker skin. Caleb had no patience for their talk, and they had no love for his silence. He rode on. The sun climbed higher, turning the sky a blinding, washed-out white. It was near the southern boundary of his land, where the property line butted up against the public grazing trails, that the mare tossed her head and blew air through her nostrils. She danced sideways, her hooves clicking sharply on the rocky ground. "Easy, girl," Caleb murmured, his hand automatically dropping to the stock of the Winchester rifle scabbarded by his knee. He scanned the horizon. Nothing moved but the heat waves and a solitary hawk circling high above, hunting for something foolish enough to leave the shade. But the mare was spooked. She smelled something he could not yet see. He urged her forward, rounding a cluster of massive boulders that marked the corner of his section. The fence line stretched out straight and true toward the canyon, but 300 yards ahead, something broke the pattern. There was a shape slumped against the third post. At this distance, it looked like a bundle of rags or perhaps a calf that had gotten tangled in the wire and died. But it was too large for a calf and too dark for a deer. A cold prickle of unease walked up Caleb's spine. He had seen many things left on fence lines in the war, warnings, trophies, atrocities. He kicked the mare into a trot, the dust billowing behind them. As he drew closer, the shape resolved into human form. It was a woman. She was on her knees, her back pressed against the cedar post, her arms pulled unnaturally high and wide. Caleb pulled the mare up short, the animal skidding in the dirt, and swung down from the saddle before the horse had even stopped moving. The silence of the desert seemed to roar in his ears. She was Apache. He knew this not by her dress, which was torn and filthy, but by the structure of her face and the braid that hung heavy with dust over her shoulder. She was chained to his fence. Caleb stood frozen for a heartbeat, his mind struggling to process the brutality of the tableau before him. Thick, rusted iron cuffs clamped her wrists. The chain was short, looped through the fence wire and padlocked around the post, forcing her to kneel in the dirt. She had been there all night. He could see the evidence of it, the way her skin was gray and papery from the cold of the high desert dark, and now burned by the morning sun. He took a step forward, his boots crunching on the gravel. The woman's head lolled forward, her chin resting on her chest. At the sound of his approach, she flinched, a violent, full-body spasm that rattled the chains against the wood. She lifted her head. Caleb felt the breath leave his lungs. Her face was a ruin of exhaustion and dehydration. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, swollen where she had bitten them. Dirt was caked into the hollows of her eyes. But it was the eyes themselves that stopped him cold. They were dark, endless wells of terror and resignation. There was no fight left in them, only a terrible, hollow waiting. He saw the graffiti then. Someone had taken a branding iron or a heated knife and burned words into the wood of the fence post, just above her head. The letters were jagged and crude, spelling out slurs that made Caleb's stomach turn over. He saw the bruises blooming like dark violets on her bare arms, and the raw, bloody rings where the iron cuffs had eaten into her wrists as she must have pulled and struggled during the night. She looked at him, and he saw her register his white skin, his hat, the pistol on his hip. She did not scream. She did not beg for water. Instead, her shoulders slumped, the tension leaving her body not in relief, but in defeat. She looked at him with a gaze that stripped away his humanity, expecting him to be exactly like the men who had done this to her. "Do whatever you want," she rasped. Her voice was like dry leaves scraping over stone. It was a voice that had already screamed itself out. She closed her eyes and turned her face slightly away, bracing herself for a blow, or worse. Caleb stood there, the sun beating down on his neck, and felt a wave of shame so profound it nearly brought him to his knees. It was not shame for anything he had done today, but shame for his likeness, shame for the species of men he belonged to. He looked at this woman, broken and discarded on the edge of his land like refuse, offered up as entertainment for the monsters who passed for men in the town. He remembered a village on the Red River 10 years ago. He remembered smoke and the sound of women weeping. The ghost of that memory superimposed itself over the reality before him. And for a moment, the rage was so hot it blinded him. He forced himself to breathe. He unbuckled his canteen with shaking hands, but then he stopped. If he moved too fast, she might snap. "I am not going to hurt you," he said. His voice sounded rusty, unused. She did not open her eyes. She did not believe him. Why would she? Caleb holstered the canteen and drew the heavy Bowie knife from his belt. The metal flashed in the sunlight. The woman flinched again, her muscles bunching, but she remained silent, waiting for the cut. He stepped closer, moving as one might move toward a trapped wolf. "Look at me," he commanded softly. "Look at me." She opened her eyes, watching the knife. "I am going to cut the rope," he said, pointing to the thick hemp that bound the chain to the lower wire. "Just the rope." He knelt beside her. She smelled of sage, stale sweat, and old fear. Up close, he could see the tremors racking her frame, the way her pulse hammered frantically in the hollow of her throat. He reached out with his left hand to grasp the chain, and she recoiled, pressing herself hard against the harsh wood of the post. "Easy," he whispered. "Easy now." He sawed through the rope that secured the chain to the fence. It was thick, tarred stuff, but his knife was sharp. With a final snap, the rope gave way. The chain clattered down, hanging loose from her wrists. "The lock," he muttered to himself. He examined the cuffs. They were old slave irons, likely relics from the war, with a heavy keyhole. He did not have the key. He looked at the post where the chain had been padlocked. The padlock itself was cheap. The hasp rusted. He stood up and walked back to his horse. The woman watched him, her eyes tracking his every movement, confusion flickering in the depths of her fear. She waited for him to retrieve a whip or a rope. Instead, Caleb pulled a pair of heavy fencing pliers from his saddlebag. He walked back to her. "Turn your head," he said. She did not move. "Cover your face," he ordered, more firmly. She lowered her head, shielding her eyes with her shoulder. Caleb gripped the padlock with the jaws of the heavy pliers. He braced his boot against the post and squeezed. The muscles in his forearms corded with effort. He gritted his teeth, groaning with the exertion. The metal groaned back, resisting, until finally, with a loud crack, the hasp sheared. He pulled the chain free from the post. She was detached from the fence, but the cuffs remained on her wrists, linked by a foot of heavy chain. "I cannot get the irons off here," he said, his voice low. "I have tools at the house." The woman stared at her hands, then at the open desert. She tried to stand. She got one foot under her, her limbs shaking violently, and tried to push herself up. Her knees buckled instantly. She fell forward. Caleb caught her before she hit the ground. His arms went around her waist and shoulders, and he was shocked by how light she was, as if the heat had evaporated the very substance of her. Through the thin, torn fabric of her dress, her skin was burning hot. Fever. She gasped when he touched her, a sharp intake of breath like a sob. She thrashed weakly, her hands coming up to push at his chest, the heavy chain striking him in the sternum. "No," she moaned. "No, no, I've got you," he said, holding her firm so she would not hurt herself. "I've got you. You are sick." She looked up at him, her eyes wide and glassy, seeing a demon. "Let me die," she whispered. "Let me die here." Caleb looked at the endless, empty horizon. If he left her, the coyotes would be here by sundown. If the dehydration didn't kill her first, the exposure would. He looked back toward the town. If anyone saw him with her, the questions would be immediate and dangerous. A white man carrying an Apache woman, a woman who had clearly been put on that fence as a punishment or a warning, would be branded a traitor, or worse. The Army scouts patrolled these ridges. The sheriff's deputies rode these trails. He felt the old soldier's instinct to survive, to turn his back and ride away, to let the desert finish what the town had started. It was the safe choice. It was the smart choice. Then he looked at her wrists again, at the raw meat where the iron had chewed through her skin. "Damn them," he whispered. "Damn them all to hell." He stooped and scooped her up into his arms. She was too weak to fight him now. Her head fell back against his shoulder, her eyes rolling up in her head. He carried her to the mare. The horse sidestepped, nervous at the smell of blood and sickness. But Caleb held the reins tight. He struggled to lift the woman, his own back protesting, until he managed to drape her over the front of the saddle. He swung up behind her, settling her body so she rested against his chest. He felt the heat of her fever soaking into his shirt. He took the reins in one hand and wrapped his other arm securely around her waist to keep her from falling. "Walk on," he told the mare. He did not ride back the way he had come. He kept to the low ground, navigating the dry washes and arroyos, keeping the ridge line between himself and the open plain. He rode with his head on a swivel, his eyes constantly sweeping the skyline for the telltale puff of dust that would signal a rider. Every jackrabbit that bolted from the brush made his heart hammer against his ribs. The journey back to the cabin took 2 hours. To Caleb, it felt like 2 years. The woman drifted in and out of consciousness. Sometimes she would mutter in her own tongue, rapid, clicking words filled with distress. Sometimes she would whimper when the horse stumbled. Caleb held her tighter, whispering nonsense words meant to soothe a spooked animal. When the cabin finally came into view, a squat structure of rough-hewn logs and mud mortar, sitting in the shadow of a cottonwood tree by the dry creek bed, Caleb let out a breath he felt he had been holding since sunrise. He rode directly to the door, dismounting quickly. He pulled her down from the saddle, carrying her across the threshold and out of the blinding sun. The interior of the cabin was dim and cool. It smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and gun oil. It was a bachelor's space, sparse and utilitarian. There was a single narrow bed in the corner covered with a wool blanket. Caleb laid her down on it gently. She looked small and dark against the gray wool. The silence of the room settled around them, heavy and strange. Caleb went to the water bucket by the stove. He took a tin cup and a spoon. He pulled a chair to the bedside and sat down. "Wake up," he said softly. She groaned, her eyelids fluttering. "Drink," he said. He dipped the spoon into the cup and brought it to her lips. The water spilled down her chin. He tried again, tilting her head up slightly. She swallowed reflexively, then coughed, her body seizing. "Slow," he admonished. "Slowly." He spent the next hour getting half a cup of water into her. When she seemed stable, he turned his attention to her wrists. He fetched a basin of water and a bar of lye soap, along with a bottle of whiskey he kept for special occasions, usually to drown the memories on the anniversary of a battle. He tore the sleeve off one of his spare shirts, ripping the cotton into long, clean strips. When he touched the wet cloth to her wrist, she jerked awake, her eyes snapping open. She tried to pull away, crying out in a language he did not speak. "It is all right," he said, keeping his voice flat and calm. "I am cleaning it. The infection will take your hands if I do not." She stared at him, panting, her chest heaving. She looked around the room, her gaze darting from the rifle on the wall to the stove to the door. "Where?" she asked. The English word was clumsy in her mouth, brittle. "My place," Caleb said. "My ranch. You are miles from town." "Prison?" she asked. Caleb paused, the rag hovering over her bloody skin. "No," he said firmly. "Not a prison. You are not a prisoner here." She watched him, her eyes narrowing with skepticism. She looked at the iron cuffs still locked around her wrists. "I cannot get them off yet," Caleb explained, pointing to the cuffs. "I need a file. The keyhole is broken. I will file them off tomorrow. Tonight, you rest." He poured a splash of whiskey over the raw wounds. She hissed through her teeth, her body arching off the mattress, a high, keen sound escaping her throat. Caleb gripped her forearm, holding her still until the stinging subsided. "I know," he murmured. "I know it burns. It burns the rot out." He wrapped her wrists in the cotton strips, tying them gently. When he was finished, he sat back, wiping his hands on his trousers. He felt exhausted, drained to the marrow. The woman lay back against the pillow, watching him. She did not say thank you. She did not smile. She watched him the way a trapped hawk watches a man, waiting for the mistake that will allow escape or the movement that signals death. "Why?" she asked. Caleb looked at his hands. They were large, rough hands, capable of violence. "Why what? Why loose?" She gestured vaguely to where the chain had been. "Why not use?" The question hung in the air, ugly and naked. It spoke of a world where kindness was an aberration and cruelty was the law of the land. Caleb met her gaze. He wanted to tell her he was a good man, but he wasn't sure that was true. He wanted to tell her he was different from the men in town, but they shared the same skin, the same language, the same history. "Because it was wrong," Caleb said simply. "What they did, it was wrong." She studied him for a long time. Then, without a word, she turned her face to the wall and closed her eyes. The afternoon wore on. Caleb busied himself with small tasks inside the cabin, afraid to leave her alone but afraid to be too close. He oiled his boots. He swept the floor. He watched the window. Every shadow that stretched across the yard looked like a rider. Every gust of wind sounded like a hoofbeat. He knew what he had done. By cutting that chain, he had declared war on the town's justice. If they found her here, they would hang him from his own cottonwood tree. They would say he was harboring a hostile, a savage, an enemy of the state. And yet, when he looked at the small form shivering under his blanket, he could not find the regret he expected. He felt fear. Yes, he felt a deep, gnawing anxiety about the future. But beneath it, there was a strange, stubborn ember of pride. For the first time since the war ended, he had drawn a line. Night fell over the high desert like a heavy curtain. The temperature plummeted. The wind picked up again, howling around the corners of the cabin, rattling the door on its hinges. Caleb did not light the lantern. Light would attract attention. He fed wood into the stove by feel, the firelight casting dancing, blood-red shadows on the walls. He pulled his heavy wooden chair to the door and sat down. He placed the Winchester across his lap, his thumb resting on the hammer. Outside, the coyotes began to sing. Their yips and howls echoed off the canyon walls, a wild, lonely chorus that celebrated the darkness. It was the sound of the hunt, the sound of teeth and hunger. Behind him, the woman's breathing was ragged and uneven, caught in the rhythm of a fever dream. Caleb Vance sat in the dark, listening to the wind and the wolves, and waited for the dawn. He was alone, and yet, for the first time in years, he was not. The cabin was a box of rough-hewn pine floating in a sea of heat. For the first 3 days, time did not move in hours or minutes, but in the slow, agonizing creep of sunlight across the dirt floor. The air inside remained thick with the smell of wood smoke, dried sage, and the metallic tang of the fever that clung to the woman on the bed. Caleb moved through the small space like a ghost in his own home, trying to shrink his large frame so as not to startle her. The single room was intimate by necessity. There was the wood stove, the table with its 2 mismatched chairs, his narrow bed which she now occupied, and the small, dusty window that framed the relentless, sun-baked emptiness of the territory. She watched him, even when the fever burned hottest. Her eyes followed his hands. She lay stiff under the wool blanket, her body a tightly coiled spring waiting for the trap to snap. Trust was a currency neither of them possessed. On the second afternoon, Caleb brought a bowl of broth to the bedside. It was thin soup made from dried beef and wild onions, steaming in the cool shadow of the room. He held it out to her. She stared at the spoon, then at his face, her expression hard and flat. She did not open her mouth. Her lips were pressed into a thin line of refusal. "You need to eat," Caleb said, his voice low. "You will not get your strength back on air." She turned her face to the wall. Caleb stood there for a long moment, the bowl growing hot in his palm. He understood then. To her, he was just another white man, and in her experience, nothing a white man gave came without a price, or a poison. He pulled the chair closer and sat down, the wood groaning under his weight. He took the spoon, dipped it into the broth, and raised it to his own lips. He ate the spoonful, swallowed, and waited. He took another. Then he lifted the tin cup of water and took a long drink, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "It is just food," he said. "No poison, no sleep medicine." He placed the bowl and the cup on the apple crate he used as a bedside table, within easy reach of her hand, and stood up. "I have work outside," he said. "I will leave the door unlatched." He walked out into the blinding glare of the afternoon, leaving her alone with the choice. When he returned 2 hours later, dust caking the sweat on his neck, the bowl was empty. It was on the 4th day that she spoke her name. She was sitting up, propped against the wall, her black hair loose and falling over the rough gray of the blanket. The swelling in her face had gone down, revealing high, sharp cheekbones and a jawline set with iron determination. The bruises were fading from purple to a sickly yellow-green. Caleb was oiling a bridle at the table, the smell of leather and grease filling the room. "What do I call you?" he asked, not looking up from his work. "I cannot keep calling you Miss in my head." She studied him for a long time. Silence stretched between them, comfortable for him, calculated for her. "Nalin," she said. The word was short, sharp, like the snap of a dry twig. Nailin, Caleb repeated, testing the weight of it. Does it mean something? It means maiden, she said. Her English was broken but clear, the vowels round and hard. She lifted her chin slightly, wincing as the movement pulled at a bruise on her neck. I am Nalin, of the She-Hen. I am Caleb, he said. I know, she replied. I heard you talk to the horse. Caleb stopped polishing the leather. He looked at her. Tell me who did it. Nalin, who put you on that fence? The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Nalin's eyes, which had been wary but present, suddenly went distant, staring at something through the cabin walls that Caleb could not see. Men from town, she said. Her voice was devoid of inflection, cold as a winter creek. 3 of them. They found me near the wash. They had rope. Caleb waited, his hands still. They wanted to hear me scream, she continued, her gaze fixed on the dust motes dancing in a shaft of sunlight. They dragged me. They put the iron on me. They laughed when I fought. They said I was a lesson. A lesson for who? For any Apache who thinks they are people, she said. She looked at him then, and the hatred in her eyes was searing. They laughed. They drank whiskey and burned the wood and laughed. She stopped. The shutter came down behind her eyes. She pulled the blanket up to her chin and turned away, effectively ending the conversation. Caleb looked at his hands, stained with oil and dirt, and felt a surge of impotent rage so strong his fingers cramped around the leather reins. Outside, the land demanded his attention regardless of the drama unfolding within. The drought was a physical weight pressing down on the ranch. The sky was a relentlessly empty blue, devoid of clouds, a vast, indifferent eye staring down at the struggling earth. Caleb spent his days fighting a losing war against the elements. He hauled water from the creek, which had receded to a muddy trickle 3 miles east. He drove the wagon out in the morning, filled the barrels with a bucket, and drove back, the water sloshing precious ounces into the thirsty dust. The windmill, a skeletal tower of timber and iron standing near the corral, groaned incessantly in the dry wind. The gears were worn, screaming with every rotation of the vanes. Caleb spent an entire morning perched precariously at the top, greasing the mechanism while the wind tried to tear him from his perch. From that height, the land looked like a wrinkled hide, brown and scarred. He checked the cattle. They were thin, their ribs showing like the staves of a barrel through their dusty coats. They huddled in the scant shade of the mesquite, chewing listlessly on dry bunch grass. He moved them to the north pasture, where the grass was slightly better, riding the fence lines to ensure there were no breaks where they could wander off and die. It was while he was dragging dead brush to patch a gap in the corral fence that he saw them. He paused, wiping sweat from his eyes with his forearm, and scanned the southern horizon. The air was shimmering with heat haze, distorting distance and shape, but he knew the silhouette of riders. There were 2 of them. They were miles away, tiny black specks moving against the backdrop of the red bluffs. They were not moving in a straight line of travel. They were circling, pausing, scanning. Caleb's stomach tightened into a hard knot. They were looking for something, or someone. He dropped the branch he was holding and walked casually to where his rifle leaned against the post. He did not raise it, but he checked the load. He watched them for 20 minutes until they dipped below a rise and vanished. They were too far to see him, likely, but they were close enough to be a promise of trouble. He realized then that the clock was ticking. The town had not forgotten the woman on the fence. They were hunting. Inside the cabin, Nailin was fighting her own war. When Caleb was gone, the silence of the room was oppressive. She was weak, her legs trembling like a newborn foal's when she tried to stand. But she refused to lie still. She was Nalin. She had walked across the white sands with a baby on her back. She had survived the fever that took her mother. She would not die in a white man's bed. She moved around the room, touching the objects that made up Caleb's life. Her fingers, still wrapped in the white bandages he changed every evening, brushed over the rough surface of the table. She found a tin of tobacco and opened it. smelling the sweet, pungent aroma of the dried leaves. It reminded her of her grandfather's pipe, a sudden, sharp memory that made her chest ache. She found a heavy book with black leather covers on the shelf, a Bible. She opened it. She could not read the black marks, but she saw a list of names written in the front. Joshua Vance, Sarah Vance, Caleb Vance. Dates were written beside them. Most of the dates had a second date beside them, marking the end. It was a book of the dead. Then she found the box. It was a small wooden crate tucked under the bed. She pulled it out, her breath catching in her throat. Inside was a jacket made of blue wool. She recoiled, snatching her hand back as if the fabric were a snake. It was a soldier's coat. The yellow trim was faded, the wool moth-eaten in places, but the brass buttons still held a dull shine. Beside it lay a stack of letters tied with twine and a medal on a ribbon. She stared at the coat. This was the skin of the enemy. These were the men who had burned the winter food stores. These were the men who had chased her people into the rocks. When Caleb returned that evening, she looked at him differently. She saw the way he stood, the way he walked. She saw the soldier beneath the rancher, and the fear that had begun to ebb came rushing back, cold and sharp. 3 days later, the sky turned the color of a fresh bruise. The wind died first. The silence that followed was heavy, pressurized. The birds stopped singing. The cattle in the corral ceased their lowing and huddled together, tails to the north. Caleb was in the barn when he felt the pressure drop. He stepped out and looked north. A wall of brown darkness was swallowing the horizon, stretching from the earth to the heavens. It boiled and churned, a solid mass of dust moving faster than a horse could gallop. "Dust storm," he muttered. He ran for the cabin, slamming the door behind him and dropping the heavy wooden bar into place. "What is it?" Nellen asked from the bed. She sensed his urgency. "Storm," Caleb said. "A big one. It will get dark." He moved quickly, stuffing rags into the cracks around the door and the window frame. He had barely finished when the first gust hit. It slammed into the cabin like a physical blow, a giant fist punching the timber. The entire structure groaned. Then the darkness swallowed them. The sun was blotted out completely. The sound was deafening, a high-pitched shriek of wind forcing grit through every pore of the wood, combined with the heavy, battering roar of the gale. Nellen screamed. It was not a scream of surprise, but of pure, unadulterated terror. The sound of the wind, the sudden darkness, the choking dust that instantly filled the air. It transported her back. She was not in a cabin. She was in the canyon. The soldiers were coming. The noise was the sound of gunfire and screaming horses. The smoke was choking her. She scrambled off the bed, her legs tangling in the blanket. She hit the floor hard but scrambled up, backing away until she hit the wall. She clawed at the logs, her fingernails tearing at the wood, her eyes wide and unseeing. "They are here!" she shrieked in Apache. "Run! They are burning the tents!" Caleb turned from the window. "Nellen!" She did not hear him. She was hyperventilating, sliding down the wall, curling into a tight ball, her hands over her ears to shut out the roar of the attack. Caleb crossed the room. He knew better than to grab a person in that state. He knelt beside her, keeping a foot of distance between them. The dust was thick in the room now, coating his teeth, stinging his eyes. "Nellen," he said, pitching his voice under the howl of the wind. "Nellen, listen to me." She was rocking back and forth, sobbing, muttering names of the dead. "Look at the floor," Caleb said firmly. "Nellen, feel the wood under your hands." He reached out and placed his hand flat on the floorboards near hers. "It is wood," he said. "It is pine. You are in a cabin. There is no fire. There are no soldiers." She gasped, choking on the dust. She looked at his hand. It was a large hand, scarred and brown. It was steady. "Listen to my voice." Caleb said, "I am Caleb. You are Nellen. We are safe. The wind is just wind. It cannot hurt you." She looked up at him. Her eyes were wild, darting around the room, expecting to see blue coats and sabers. but she saw only the stove, the table, and the man kneeling in the dust. "Just wind," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Just wind," Caleb promised. "It will pass." He stayed there, kneeling beside her, for an hour. The storm raged, tearing at the roof, but inside, the panic slowly receded. Nayland's breathing slowed. She uncurled slightly, for the first time since he had cut her from the fence. She reached out, her hand, wrapped in the white bandage, touched his shoulder. She needed to know he was solid. She needed an anchor in the storm. Caleb did not flinch. He let her hold on to his shirt, feeling the tremors in her hand slowly subside. When the wind finally died down to a manageable gust, the silence that returned was ringing. The cabin was coated in a fine layer of red silt. It was in the bedding, on the table, in the water bucket. Nayland coughed, wiping her face. She looked at the mess. "I will help," she said. She grabbed the edge of the table and pulled herself up. Her legs were shaky, but she locked her knees. "You should rest," Caleb said, standing up. "I will not lie like a dead one," she snapped. "Give me the broom." And so they worked. It was a strange, silent partnership. Caleb shoveled the drifts of sand away from the door, while Nayland swept the interior, her movements slow but determined. She paused often to lean on the broom handle, breathing hard, but she refused to sit until the floor was clean. That night, the air was cold and clear. Caleb built a fire in the stove, the wood cracking sharply. They ate in silence, the exhaustion of the storm hanging over them. Nayland sat on the edge of the bed, the blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Caleb sat in his chair, staring into the open grate of the stove. "I saw the blue coat," Nayland said suddenly. Caleb stiffened. He did not look at her. "I know. You were a soldier." "I was a scout," Caleb said, "for the 3rd Cavalry. You killed my people." It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, as cold and hard as the iron he had cut from her wrists. Caleb looked at the fire. He could lie. He could say he was a cook or a supplier, but the lie would not hold in this room. "I rode with them," Caleb said. "I followed orders. We were told we were making the land safe. That is what they said." "Safe," Nayland repeated with bitterness. "Safe for who?" "Not for you," Caleb admitted. He turned to look at her. His face was etched with the old pain. "I watched them burn the village at Red Rock. I watched them drive families into the snow. I saw women carrying children, running barefoot on the ice." He paused, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I stopped counting the dead," he said softly. "And then I stopped being able to tell the difference between right and wrong. So I left. I took off the coat and I walked away. But walking away does not wash the blood off." Nayland listened, her face unreadable in the firelight. She pulled the blanket tighter. "My brother was at Red Rock," she said. Caleb felt the blood drain from his face. "He was young," Nayland said. "He had a pony he loved. The soldiers shot the pony. Then they shot him. We ran for days. We went to the reservation because the old ones were dying of hunger." She looked at the fire, her eyes reflecting the flames. "The reservation was a graveyard," she said. "The meat they gave us was rotten. The blankets were full of sickness. I watched my mother cough until her chest broke. So I left. I ran away. I thought I could find the free bands in the mountains." She looked at Caleb. "Then the white men found me, and they put me on your fence." The silence that followed was thick with ghosts. Their stories were 2 rivers of blood flowing into the same sea of tragedy. They were enemies by history, by color, by every law of the territory. "You rode with them," she said again. "I did," Caleb said. "I cannot change that." "No," she said. "You cannot." She looked at him, searching his face. She saw the guilt that lived in the lines around his mouth. She saw the shame that made him look away. It did not fix the past. It did not bring her brother back, but it was something. A white man who felt shame was a rare thing. "I can take you to the mountains," Caleb said suddenly. "When you are strong, I can give you a horse and supplies. You can try to find your people." Nayland shook her head slowly. "The men who chained me are out there," she said. "If I go now, they will catch me. And if I find my people, I will lead the soldiers to them. I have the smell of the white man on me now. They might kill me themselves. So what will you do?" "I will stay," she said. "For now. Until I can shoot straight. Until I can ride without falling." She met his gaze, and her chin lifted in that gesture of stubborn pride he was coming to know. "But this is not my cage. Caleb," she said. "I am not your prisoner. I leave when I choose." "Agreed," Caleb said. "You are free to go. Always." In the days that followed, the dynamic in the cabin shifted. Naylin grew stronger. The fever broke completely, leaving her thin but clear-eyed. She began to take over small parts of the domestic routine. She sat at the table and chopped vegetables for the stew, her movements awkward with her bandaged wrists but precise. One evening, Caleb tore his shirt on a nail in the barn. He came in, cursing softly, the fabric flapping open at the shoulder. "Take it off," Naylin commanded. Caleb hesitated, then unbuttoned the shirt and handed it to her. He stood there in his undershirt, feeling exposed. Naylin took a needle and thread from the small tin box on the shelf. She sat by the lamp, pulling the fabric taut. Caleb watched her hands. The bandages were smaller now. Her fingers were long and brown, moving with a dexterity that fascinated him. "Sit," she said. He sat on the crate beside her. She leaned in to bite the thread. She handed the shirt back, but then she reached out to brush a stray thread from his shoulder. Her fingers grazed his skin through the thin cotton of his undershirt. The contact was electric. It was a sudden, sharp jolt that went straight to Caleb's gut. He froze. Naylin froze. They were inches apart in the cramped, warm room. He could smell the sage in her hair. She could smell the sweat and tobacco on him. The air between them seemed to vibrate with a sudden, terrifying awareness. They were a man and a woman, alone in a vast emptiness, bound by a secret and a shared survival. Naylin pulled her hand back slowly, her eyes wide. She looked at him, and for a second, the barrier of race and history wavered, leaving only the raw, confusing truth of two living bodies in a dead land. Caleb stood up abruptly, the chair scraping loud on the floor. "I need to check the horses," he said, his voice rough. He grabbed his hat and went out into the dark, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Naylin watched him go, her hand touching the place on her own chest where her heart beat just as fast. The town of Blackwater was a collection of raw lumber and bad intentions huddled against the base of the foothills, 15 miles south of Caleb's land. It was a place where the wind smelled of coal smoke and manure, and the silence of the desert was replaced by the clanking of riggings and the loud, nervous laughter of men who drank to forget how big the dark was outside. Caleb rode in on a Tuesday, his hat pulled low, the brim casting a shadow over his eyes. He needed flour, coffee, and cartridges. The mundane necessities of life did not stop just because his world had tilted on its axis. He tied the mare to the hitching rail outside the mercantile. The street was busy. A freight wagon was unloading crates of mining equipment, the teamsters shouting and cracking whips. But underneath the noise, there was a current of tension, a static charge in the air that Caleb recognized from his days in the service. It was the feeling of a place bracing for violence. Inside the store, the air was thick with the smell of pickled eggs and sawdust. Caleb moved to the counter, keeping his head down. He ordered 50 pounds of flour and a tin of Arbuckle's coffee, while the clerk, a nervous man with wire-rimmed spectacles named Abernathy, weighed out the order. The bell above the door jingled. 2 men walked in. Caleb did not turn, but he watched their reflections in the dusty window pane. It was Silas Thorne and the sheriff, a man named Webb who wore his badge like a license to bully rather than a duty to protect. Thorne was the largest rancher in the county, a man who owned half the valley and believed he owned the law along with it. "I am telling you, Sheriff," Thorne was saying, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble that carried to the back of the store. "It was her. Had to be. My boys found the fence cut, not broken. Cut! Caleb felt a cold stone settle in his gut. He kept his eyes on the counter, his hand resting casually near the revolver on his hip. You said you chained her tight. Silas. Webb replied. The sheriff sounded tired. A woman doesn't just chew through iron. Oh, an Apache ain't a woman. Thorne spat. She is a wolf, and now she is loose. You heard about the fiery raid on the Miller place? 2 calves slaughtered. A fire set near the barn. Caleb knew the Miller place. He also knew that the Miller boys were drunks who often let their branding fires get out of hand and blamed the consequences on anyone but themselves. We have got a witness, Thorne continued, leaning against the counter, ignoring Caleb's back. Old man Henderson saw a shape moving in the brush. Said it looked like a squaw. Said she had a knife. If she is out there, Webb said. She is hurt. You said you worked her over good? I taught her a lesson, Thorne corrected. Or I tried to. I rode by that fence line yesterday. The post was scrubbed. Someone tried to clean the blood off the wood, and the wire was patched. Neat work. Too neat for a savage. Caleb's heart hammered against his ribs. He had scrubbed the post. He had fixed the wire because he could not abide a broken fence, even one that had been used for torture. It was a habit of order that might now hang him. You thinking she has help? Webb asked. I'm thinking there is a traitor in the county. Thorne growled. Or a fool. Either way, that woman is a spark in a hayloft. We need to put her down before she brings a whole raiding party down from the reservation. You know how they get. They will come for her, and they will burn every homestead from here to the river. The clerk pushed the sack of flour across the counter. That will be $3. Caleb. At the sound of his name, silence fell over the room. Caleb felt Thorne's eyes bore into his back. He deliberately kept his movements slow. He fished the coins from his pocket and placed them on the wood. He turned. Silas Thorne was watching him. Eyes narrowed in a face that looked like it was carved from granite. Vance, Thorne said. It was not a greeting. Thorne, Caleb replied. You been out by the south section lately? Thorne asked. Near the canyon. I keep to my own land. Caleb lied. His voice was steady, but his palms were damp. Is that so? Thorne took a step forward. He smelled of whiskey and old sweat. You are a quiet man. Vance, you live out there all alone. You see anything unusual? I see dust, Caleb said. I see cattle. That is all. Thorne studied him, looking for a twitch, a bead of sweat, a flicker of guilt. Caleb met his gaze with the flat, dead stare he had learned in the army, the stare of a man who has ceased to care about intimidation. If you see her, Thorne said softly, you put a bullet in her. You hear me? She is a danger to decent folks. She killed a white family up north. That is the word coming down the wire. It was a lie. A bold, terrified lie meant to whip the town into a frenzy. I hear you, Caleb said. He picked up his flour and walked out. He felt Thorne's eyes on him until the door swung shut. As he loaded his saddlebags, he heard laughter from the saloon across the street, harsh, jagged laughter. They were talking about a hunt. They were talking about blood. The ride back to the cabin was a long corridor of anxiety. Caleb watched his back trail for 5 miles, stopping twice to glass the horizon. He saw no one, but the feeling of being watched, of the net tightening, was heavy in the air. When he crested the final ridge and saw the cabin, smoke curling lazily from the chimney, he felt a mixture of relief and dread. He was harboring a fugitive, and the wolves were gathering. Inside the cabin, the world was smaller, quieter, but no less intense. Nayland was no longer the invalid who lay shivering in the bed. In the weeks since he had brought her here, she had remade herself. The frailty was gone, replaced by a lean, whipcord strength. She was not in the cabin when he entered. Caleb set the supplies on the table and stepped out the back door. He found her by the creek bed, a quarter of a mile from the house. She was walking barefoot through the brittle yellow grass. She wore a skirt she had fashioned from an old blanket and one of his shirts, belted at the waist with a piece of rope. She was moving with a slow, deliberate grace, placing each foot carefully, feeling the earth, testing the silence. She paused, head cocked, listening to the wind in the cottonwoods. She was mapping the land. She was learning the defiles, the hiding spots, the way the sound carried off the ridge. Caleb watched her for a moment. She looked part of the landscape, as if she had grown from the soil alongside the sagebrush. She turned, sensing his eyes before he spoke. "You are back," she said. "I am back." He walked down to meet her. "You should not be out this far. If I can see you, they can see you." "I am low," she said. "I am the color of the grass." "You saw me because you know where to look." She looked at his face, reading the tension he carried from town. "Bad news?" "Lies," Caleb said. "Thorne is spreading lies. He says you killed a family. He says you are leading a war party." Nayland's face hardened. "They need a monster," she said. "So they paint one. He knows someone messed with the fence." Caleb warned. He saw the scrubbed wood. Nayland looked down at her wrists. The scabs were healing, turning into white scars that would circle her arms forever. "He wants his property back. He wants you dead. Nalin, he is scared." "Good," she said. "He should be." They walked back to the cabin in silence. The sun was setting, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and purple. That evening, the routine of their cohabitation resumed. But the air was charged with the news from town. They sat at the rough table, the lantern casting a golden circle of light between them. Caleb was teaching her words. It was a practical necessity, but it had become a ritual. "Flour," Caleb said, pointing to the sack. "Flour," Nayland repeated. Her accent softened the hard edges of the word. "Cartridge," he said, placing a brass casing on the table. "Cartridge." She picked up the casing, rolling it between her fingers. Then she looked at him, a glint of challenge in her dark eyes. "Now you," she said. She pointed to the water bucket. Two, Caleb tried. He fumbled the tone, making it flat. Nayland shook her head. "No, two, like the wind, not like the stone." Caleb tried again. "Two." She suppressed a smile. "Better, but you still sound like a bear with a throat ache." She pointed to the fire. "Co, Caleb said confidently. Nayland's eyes widened, and then she let out a sound Caleb had never heard from her before. It was a laugh, short, sharp, and genuine. It was the sound of a bell ringing in a tomb. "What?" Caleb asked, defensive but smiling despite himself. "You said grandmother?" she explained, her eyes dancing. "You pointed at the fire and called it grandmother." Caleb chuckled, a rusty sound. "Well, she keeps us warm. She cooks the food. Maybe she is a grandmother." For a moment, the laughter hung in the air, connecting them. It was a fragile bridge across the chasm of their histories. They looked at each other, the amusement fading into something heavier, something warmer. Nayland watched him. She saw the way the lantern light caught the gray in his beard, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners. She saw a man who had ridden into the mouth of the wolf to bring her flour. Caleb watched her. He saw the firelight on her skin, the strength in her hands, the intelligence that burned behind her eyes. He felt a pull, a magnetic gravity that terrified him. She reached out to take the cartridge from his hand. Her fingers brushed his palm. The touch was electric. Caleb flinched, not away, but in reaction to the sudden heat. Nayland did not pull back. She held his gaze, her breath catching slightly. Then the moment broke. Caleb stood up, clearing his throat. "I need to bank the fire." He turned away, his heart thumping like a drum. 2 nights later, the weather turned. It was early for a hard frost. But the high desert did not consult the calendar. The wind shifted to the north, bringing air that tasted of snow and iron. By midnight, the temperature inside the cabin had dropped below freezing. The cabin was drafty. The chinking between the logs had crumbled in places, and the wind whistled through, carrying needles of ice. Caleb woke to the sound of teeth chattering. He lay in his bedroll on the floor. He had insisted she take the bed, and listened. Nayland was curled into a tight ball under the single wool blanket, shivering violently. The bed frame rattled with the force of her tremors. Caleb sat up, He was cold, but he had his heavy coat over him. She had only the thin blanket and her dress. "Nalin," he whispered. She did not answer, just made a small, miserable sound in her throat. Caleb stood up. He walked to the bed. He could feel the cold radiating off the walls. "Take my coat," he said, stripping the heavy buffalo coat from his shoulders and laying it over her. It was not enough. The cold was bone deep. She continued to shake, her breathing shallow and fast. Hypothermia was a silent killer in these parts. Caleb stood in the dark, wrestling with propriety, with fear, with desire. He knew what he had to do to keep her warm, and he knew how dangerous it was. Not for her safety, he would never hurt her, but for his own soul. "Nalin," he said, his voice rough. "The coat is not enough. You're freezing." She turned her head, her eyes catching the dim light of the dying embers in the stove. "Cold," she stammered. "We have to share the heat," Caleb said. The words felt heavy, clumsy. "I am going to lie down, to keep the cold off." She went still. She studied him in the darkness. She knew what this meant. A man and a woman in the same bed. In her culture, as in his, it crossed a line. But she also knew she was freezing to death. She sensed his fear. It was rolling off him in waves. He was terrified of her judgment, terrified of his own body. "Agreed," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But terms." "Name them," Caleb said. "You touch me only if I say," she said. "No hands, just backs." "I swear it," Caleb said. "Just warmth, nothing else." He sat on the edge of the bed and removed his boots. He kept his trousers and shirt on. He lifted the blankets and slid in beside her, facing the wall. The mattress sagged. He could feel the heat of her body, faint but present, seeking his. He lay stiff as a board, his muscles locked. "Back to back," she instructed. They shifted. He pressed his back against hers. The contact was shocking. Through the layers of fabric, he could feel the curve of her spine, the sharpness of her shoulder blades. He could feel the tremors slowly subsiding as his body heat began to seep into hers. He closed his eyes, clenching his fists against his chest. He counted his breaths. 1, 2, 3. The scent of her, sage, wood smoke, and woman, filled his head. His heart was hammering so hard he was sure she could feel it against her own ribs. The desire that washed over him was not just physical. It was an overwhelming need to turn, to hold her, to bury his face in her hair, and forget the war, the ranch, the town. But he did not move. He was a statue of honor in the dark. Minutes passed. The shivering stopped. Nalin's breathing evened out. She lay awake, eyes open. She could feel the tension in him. It was a vibrating wire, taut and humming. She knew men. She knew what they wanted. She knew the violence that usually accompanied that want. But this man was fighting himself. He was waging a war against his own nature to keep a promise to her. She moved her hand, tentatively. She reached back. Her fingers found his hand where it was clenched against his chest. She touched his knuckles. They were rough, scarred, and white-knuckled with strain. Caleb stopped breathing. "You are shaking," she whispered. "I am cold." He lied. "You are not cold," she said softly. She slid her fingers over his, not gripping, just resting there, acknowledging. "You could," she said into the darkness. "You're strong. I am weak. You could take." Caleb swallowed hard. "I am not that man. I know," she said. "You could, but you do not." She squeezed his hand once, firmly. It was an offering of trust that meant more than any treaty. "Sleep, Caleb." He exhaled, a long, ragged breath. He did not turn. He did not pull his hand away. He let her hold it, and eventually, exhausted by the tension, they slept. They were woken by the sound of thunder, but the sky was clear. It was not thunder. It was the rhythm of galloping horses. Caleb was out of the bed before his eyes were fully open. He grabbed his rifle from the wall and moved to the window. It was pitch black outside, but on the southern horizon, 3 miles out, he saw them, pinpricks of yellow light, lanterns. They were bobbing and weaving. moving in a line. "What is it?" Nayland asked, sitting up, clutching the blanket to her chest. "Search party," Caleb said grimly. "They are combing the flats. They are heading this way." He pulled on his coat and boots, his movements jerky with adrenaline. "They are looking for tracks. The frost will help them. It holds signs." He turned to her. "Get dressed. Put your shoes on." Nayland scrambled out of bed. She grabbed the shirt she had been wearing. "I go," she said. Caleb spun around. "What?" "I go tonight," she said, her voice fierce. "If they find me here, they hang you. They burn this place. I go to the rocks. I lead them away." "You will freeze in an hour," Caleb snapped, "or they will run you down in the open. You cannot outrun horses on foot. Nalin." "I will not let you die for me," she shouted. It was the first time she had raised her voice. The anger in it was pure and hot. "I am not asking," Caleb shouted back. "You are staying put." "Who are you to tell me?" She stepped close to him, poking him in the chest with a finger. "You think you own me because you cut the chain? You think you are my father, my chief? You are a white man who feels guilty. You want to keep me so you can feel clean." The words hit Caleb like a physical blow. He grabbed her by the shoulders. He did not mean to be rough, but his fear made his grip like iron. "This ain't about guilt," he roared. "And it ain't about owning. You think I care about the past right now? Look at those lights. Nayland, those are men coming to kill you, and I will be damned to hell if I let them take you while I stand here and watch." "Then let me save you," she cried, tears sudden and bright in her eyes. "I am tired. Caleb, I am tired of running. I am tired of hiding in holes. I am tired of being the rabbit. Maybe I should just walk out there. Maybe I should go back to the fence and lie down and let them finish it. At least then it stops." She went limp in his grasp. The fight drained out of her, leaving only a terrible, crushing exhaustion. "I am just so tired," she whispered. Caleb looked at her. He saw the despair that was threatening to swallow her whole. The fear that he had been holding back broke the dam. He pulled her to him. It was not a gentle embrace. It was a desperate clutch. He wrapped his arms around her and held her tight against his chest, burying his face in her neck. "Don't you say that," he choked out. His voice shook. "Don't you ever say that. You are not a stray calf to be handed back, and you are not going to die. Not while I have breath." Nayland stood frozen for a second, stunned by the intensity of his reaction. She felt his body shaking. She felt the wetness of a tear against her skin. He cared. It was not duty. It was not guilt. It was love, raw and terrified and undeniable. She raised her arms and wrapped them around him, holding him just as tight. They stood there in the dark cabin, the cold wind whistling through the logs, holding onto each other as the lanterns drew closer. "Caleb," she whispered. He pulled back, keeping his hands on her arms. He looked into her eyes. "We are not running," he said, "and we are not hiding. Not anymore." "What do we do?" "I go to town," Caleb said. The plan formed in his mind, sharp and dangerous. "I go to town and I listen. I find out exactly what they are planning. If they are coming here, I need to know when and how many. And you stay here. You hide in the root cellar if they come close. But we are done waiting for them to hunt us." He looked at the window again. The lights had paused. They were turning east, following the creek bed. They had missed the turn to the ranch road. For tonight, they were safe. "They want a monster," Caleb said, his voice low and dangerous. "They want a savage. We are going to give them the truth instead. We are going to shove it down their throats." Nayland looked at him. She saw the soldier again, but this time he was not fighting for orders. He was fighting for her. "The truth is dangerous," she said. "So are we," Caleb replied. He went to the table and picked up his revolver, checking the cylinder. "Tomorrow," he said. "We start fighting back." Nayland nodded. The fear was still there, cold in her stomach. But beside it, a new feeling was taking root. It was the heat of defiance. She was done being the victim on the fence. If she was going to die, she would die standing next to this man. "Tomorrow," she agreed. The sky over Blackwater was the color of a bruised plum. Heavy, low-hanging clouds scraped the tops of the foothills, trapping the heat and the dust in the valley floor. It was the kind of weather that made horses bite their cribbing and men reach for their bottles a little earlier in the day. Caleb Vance rode the mare down the main street at a walk. The town felt different today. It was not just the weather. There was a current of agitation in the air, a prickly sensation that crawled over the back of his neck. The street was lined with the usual assortment of false front buildings, the mercantile, the livery, the hotel, and the saloon, but the spaces between them felt filled with eyes. Men standing on the boardwalk stopped their conversations as he passed. They watched him with flat, suspicious gazes. He saw a curtain twitch in the window of the boarding house. He saw the blacksmith pause, hammer raised, to stare. Caleb kept his face impassive, his hat pulled low, but his hand hovered near the worn walnut grip of his Colt. He tied the mare in front of the general store and patted her neck. She was lathered, sensing his tension. "Easy," he murmured. "Easy now." He stepped inside the store. The bell above the door jangled, a cheerful sound that seemed out of place in the gloom of the interior. Elias, the store owner, was behind the counter, weighing out nails for a farmer. When he saw Caleb, his face tightened. Caleb waited until the farmer left. The door closed, and the silence that followed was heavy. "You should not be here." "Caleb," Elias said quietly. He was an older man with thinning hair and a spine bent by years of lifting crates. He began wiping the counter with a rag, not looking Caleb in the eye. "I need supplies. Elias, same as always." "Nothing is the same as always today," Elias muttered. He leaned over the counter, lowering his voice. "There is talk. Caleb. Bad talk. Silas Thorne and Sheriff Webb have put a price on that woman's head, $50. Dead or alive, though Thorne made it clear he prefers dead." Caleb felt his stomach turn over. $50 for a woman they chained to a fence. "They are saying she is a witch," Elias said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "They are saying she called spirits to break those chains. They have a search party gathering at the livery right now. They are talking about stringing her up proper this time. No chains, just a rope and a tree." Caleb gripped the edge of the counter. The wood bit into his palms. "She is a human being. Elias, not a wolf. To them, she is an excuse," Elias said. "An excuse to be angry. An excuse to be violent. You best watch your step, son. They are asking who helped her. A woman in that state does not just vanish into the ether." Caleb bought his coffee and beans, his movements mechanical. He needed to leave, to get back to the cabin, but he also needed to know the mind of the enemy. Information was ammunition. He walked out of the store and crossed the street to the saloon. The doors swung open, releasing a blast of stale air that smelled of spilled beer, unwashed bodies, and tobacco smoke. The room was crowded for mid-afternoon. In the center of the room, holding court at a round table, sat Silas Thorne. Thorne was a mountain of a man, his face flushed with whiskey and heat. He was gesturing with a heavy hand, recounting a story to a circle of younger men who listened with rapt, sycophantic attention. "I tell you, I had her right there," Thorne boomed. "Chained her up tight. I told her, you want to live on white man's land, you learn the rules. I gave her a lesson in civilization." The men laughed. It was a dark, ugly sound. "She squealed," Thorne said, taking a swig from his glass. "Squealed like a trapped shoat when we put the irons on. I figured a night with the coyotes would humble her, make her docile." Caleb stood by the door, the blood roaring in his ears. A wave of physical nausea washed over him. He looked at Thorne's thick, meaty hands wrapping around the glass and imagined them on Nalen's wrists. He imagined the terror she must have felt, alone in the dark, while this man went home to a warm bed and slept the sleep of the righteous. Caleb's fists clenched at his sides. He wanted to draw. He wanted to put a bullet in Thorne's chest and watch the surprise on his face. The urge was so strong it made his vision blur. Thorne looked up, his eyes, small and pig-like in the fleshy expanse of his face, locked onto Caleb. "Well, look who it is," Thorne sneered. The room went quiet. "The hermit of the high desert? Caleb Vance. Caleb did not speak. He walked to the bar and ordered a whiskey. He needed the burn to settle his stomach. You seem quiet, Vance, Thorne called out. He turned his chair to face the bar. You usually have so much to say about the law. You got nothing to say about a savage running loose? Caleb downed the whiskey in one swallow. He turned slowly. I have nothing to say to you. Silas, is that right? Thorne stood up. He was a head taller than Caleb and 50 pounds heavier. He walked over, his boots thudding on the floorboards. I find that strange. See, my boys tell me the fence on your south line looks mighty well tended. And that post where I left my property, it was scrubbed clean, like someone was trying to hide the evidence. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. The other men in the room shifted, hands drifting toward their belts. I fix my fences, Caleb said. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, though his heart was hammering against his ribs. The storm last week took down 3 posts. I replaced them. I scrubbed the wood because the rot sets in if you do not rot, Thorne repeated. He stepped closer, invading Caleb's personal space. He smelled of sour mash and malice. You know a lot about rot, don't you, soldier? Heard you saw plenty of it in the war, before you turned tail and ran. I did my time, Caleb said. You quit, Thorne spat. You turned Indian lover. That is what they say. They say you went soft. They say you cannot tell the difference between a white Christian and a red dog anymore. Caleb looked at Thorne's throat. It would be so easy. A quick strike to the windpipe, a draw and a shot. But if he killed Thorne here, he would never make it out of town, and Nailin would be alone. I saw nothing on my fence but wire and wood. Caleb lied. The lie tasted like ash in his mouth. It sat heavy in his chest, a stone of dishonor. He was denying her existence to save her life, and he hated himself for it. If you say so, Thorne said, his eyes narrowing. But we are riding out. We are turning over every rock. And if I find out you have been harboring that animal, well, accidents happen out on the range, don't they? Caleb turned his back on Thorne and walked out. It took every ounce of discipline he possessed not to run, not to fight, not to scream. He untied the mare, his hands shaking with suppressed rage. Mr. Vance. The voice came from the shadows of the alleyway beside the hotel. Caleb turned, his hand flashing to his gun. It was Mrs. Halloway, the widow who ran the inn. She was a stern woman with gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, but her eyes were kind. She held a basket of laundry in her arms. Mrs. Halloway, Caleb said, relaxing his hand. I saw you in there, she said softly. I saw you holding your temper. It was difficult, Caleb admitted. She looked around to make sure no one was watching. I saw her, Caleb, that night, before they took her out to the fence. Caleb went still. You did. They dragged her past the hotel. Mrs. Halloway whispered. She clutched the basket tighter. She was fighting them. She was brave. I wanted to call the sheriff, but the sheriff was with them. She looked down at her shoes. I did nothing. I closed my curtains. I have not slept well since. Why are you telling me this? Because you look like a man who knows where she is, Mrs. Halloway said. She looked up, her eyes fierce. It was wrong. What they did was a sin against God. But we are powerless. Caleb, men like Thorne, they are the law here. Thank you, ma'am, Caleb said. If she is alive, the widow said. Tell her not everyone in this town is a monster. Just cowardly. Caleb rode out of town under the threat of the storm. The encounter with Mrs. Halloway stayed with him. It was a crack in the wall of hate. A small crack, but a crack nonetheless. He rode hard, pushing the mare. The deception at the saloon, the lie he had told, burned in his gut. He realized with a terrifying clarity that they would not stop. Thorne would not stop until Nailin was dead, because as long as she was alive, she was proof of his cruelty. When he reached the cabin, the sun was gone, swallowed by the clouds. The wind was whipping the sagebrush into a frenzy. Nailin was waiting by the door. She saw his face and knew immediately. "They are coming," she said. Caleb dismounted and led the horse into the barn. He walked into the cabin and paced the floor, unable to sit. "They have a price on you," he said. He did not sugarcoat it. $50. Thorne is bragging about what he did. He is proud of it. And he suspects me. He knows I scrubbed the post. Naylin sat at the table, her hands folded. She was calm, a stillness in the center of his storm. "They want to kill you, Nolan," Caleb said, his voice cracking. "They want to hang you to hide their own sin. They call it justice, but it is murder." He stopped pacing and looked at her. "We have to leave. Tonight. We can pack the mules. We head north, into the high peaks. We can lose them in the snow." Naylin stood up. "No, Nolan, listen to me." "No," she said again, louder. "I am done running. Caleb, if we run to the mountains, we freeze, or the soldiers find us. And if we run, we tell them they are right. We tell them I am the guilty one. If we stay, you die," Caleb shouted. "If I run, I am already dead," she shot back. "I am a ghost in the rocks. I want to be a person. Caleb, I want them to see me." "See you?" Caleb laughed bitterly. "They see a savage. They see a target. Then I will make them see the truth," she said. The circuit judge comes this week. You told me this." "Judge Miller," Caleb said. "He is a hard man, but he follows the book." "Then I speak to him," Nolan said. "I stand in front of him, in the light, not hiding in a cellar. I tell him what Thorne did. I show him the scars." Caleb stared at her. The audacity of the plan took his breath away. An Apache woman testifying against a white landowner in a frontier court. It was suicide, and yet it was the only path that offered a shred of dignity. "They might kill us before we ever get to the judge," Caleb said. "Then we die standing," Naylin said. She walked over to him. "Why are you so afraid? Caleb, you have faced death before." "I am not afraid for me," he whispered. "I am afraid for you." "Why?" she asked. She stepped closer, invading his space, forcing him to look at her. "Why does the life of an Apache woman matter to the White Scout?" Caleb looked down at her. He saw the strength in her jaw, the fire in her eyes. He saw the woman who had survived the fence, the fever, and the loss of everything she had ever known. "Because I cannot change what I did in the war," he said, his voice trembling. "I cannot bring back the dead. I cannot unburn the villages. But I can save you. I can choose differently this time." He took a breath. "And because if I let you walk out that door and die, it will break me. There will be nothing left of me but dust." The admission hung in the air between them. It was a confession of love, stripped of all poetry and laid bare in its desperation. Naylin softened. Her eyes searched his face, seeing the raw, bleeding heart of the man beneath the scars. "Sit," she said softly. She guided him to the edge of the narrow bed. They sat side by side, their thighs touching. The storm howled outside, rattling the window pane, but inside, the world had shrunk to the two of them. Naylin reached out and placed her hand flat against his chest, over his heart. She could feel it beating, heavy, rhythmic thuds against her palm. "It beats hard," she said. "It beats for you." Caleb said, "It is a good heart," she whispered. "It is not a soldier's heart anymore." She leaned forward. Her face was inches from his. Caleb hesitated. He looked at her eyes, asking for permission, terrified of crossing the line they had drawn. Naylin nodded. A microscopic movement. Caleb leaned in. His lips brushed hers. It was not a smooth kiss. It was clumsy with fear and longing. Caleb's hands hovered in the air, afraid to touch her, afraid to grab. Naylin flinched slightly as his beard grazed her skin, a reflex of old trauma, a memory of violence. Caleb pulled back immediately. "I'm sorry. No," Naylin said. She reached up and took his hand. She guided it to her cheek, pressing his rough palm against her skin. "Do not stop. I choose this." She leaned in again, and this time, she kissed him. It was slow and trembling. It tasted of salt and coffee and fear. It was a kiss of grief for what they had lost, and a kiss of desperate hope for what they might find. Caleb's arms went around her, pulling her close. He held her as if she were made of glass. Naylin buried her hands in his hair, anchoring herself to him. They held each other, rocking slightly, while the wind screamed outside, trying to tear the roof off. 2 days later, the war came to the ranch. It was late morning. Caleb was in the barn, pitching hay. Naylin was in the garden patch, turning the soil for winter. The sound of hooves was the only warning. Caleb dropped the pitchfork and ran for the cabin. "Naylin, inside, now!" She was already moving. She dropped the hoe and sprinted for the door. They made it inside just as the riders crested the ridge. There were 6 of them. Sheriff Webb rode in front, his tin star dull in the overcast light. Silas Thorne was beside him. 4 deputies rode behind, rifles resting across their saddles. "The cellar," Caleb ordered. He pulled up the heavy trap door in the floor that led to the root cellar. It was a dark, earthen hole used for storing potatoes and turnips. "Go," he said. "Do not make a sound. No matter what they say, no matter what they do." Naylin looked at him, her eyes wide. "Caleb, go!" She dropped into the hole. Caleb lowered the trap door and kicked the rag rug over it. He dragged the heavy table across the floor until one leg rested on the rug. He grabbed his Winchester from the wall and walked out onto the porch just as the riders pulled up in a cloud of dust. "Sheriff," Caleb said. He held the rifle loosely, barrel pointed at the ground, but his finger was on the guard. "Caleb," Webb said. He looked uncomfortable. "We are here to search the premises. You have a warrant?" Caleb asked. "I don't need a warrant for a hostile." Webb said, "We have reports. Caleb, tracks leading this way. A woman's footprints." Silas Thorne rode his horse right up to the porch steps. The beast snorted, spraying foam. "Cut the talk, Webb!" Thorne growled. He looked down at Caleb with pure hatred. "We know she is here. Vance, I can smell her. You smell your own upper lip." "Silas," Caleb said coldly. Thorne's face went purple. "I will burn this shack to the ground with you in it." "Try it," Caleb said, shifting the rifle. "You might get the match lit, but you won't live to see the flame." The deputies raised their rifles. The air crackled with the threat of sudden violence. "Stand down," Webb shouted. "Nobody is shooting anyone." "Caleb, step aside. We are searching the cabin." "You are not coming in," Caleb said. "If you stop us," Webb said, his voice hard. "I will arrest you for obstruction, and then we will tear the place apart anyway. Make it easy on yourself." Caleb calculated the odds. 6 men. He had 6 rounds in the Winchester. He could take Thorne and Webb, maybe one more, then he would be dead, and they would find Naylin. He lowered the rifle. "Check the barn first." "Cabin," Webb insisted. Caleb stepped aside. "Wipe your feet." Webb and 2 deputies dismounted. They stomped up the steps and pushed past Caleb. Thorne stayed on his horse, his hand resting on his pistol, watching Caleb like a hawk. Caleb stood in the doorway, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm. He watched them overturn his bed. He watched them open the cupboards. He watched Webb walk around the table, his boots thudding inches from Naylin's head beneath the floorboards. Webb paused by the table. He looked down at the rug. Caleb stopped breathing. Webb nudged the rug with his boot. The table leg held it in place. Webb looked around the room, seeing the second chair, the extra plate drying on the rack. "You have company, Caleb?" Webb asked, pointing to the plate. "I eat twice when I'm hungry," Caleb said. Webb stared at him. He knew. He had to know. But he didn't pull the rug. Maybe it was Mrs. Holloway's words. Maybe it was a shred of decency left in the man. "Nothing here," Webb announced. "What?" Thorne roared from the yard. "Check the floorboards. She is a rat. She burrows." "I said nothing here. Silas!" Webb shouted back. He walked out onto the porch. "We are leaving." Thorne looked at Caleb. "You are hiding her. I know it. Get off my land," Caleb said. Thorne leaned forward in his saddle. The law has rules. Vance, but out here the law isn't the only way to get justice. Accidents happen. Fires start. You sleep with one eye open." He wheeled his horse around and galloped off. The deputies followed. Webb lingered for a second. "If she is here," Webb said quietly, "you tell her to keep running, because Silas is coming back, and next time, he won't bring a badge. He will bring a torch." Caleb watched them ride away until they were nothing but dust. He rushed back inside and shoved the table aside. He threw open the trap door. Nayland stood in the dark, looking up at him. She was shaking, but her face was set in stone. He pulled her up. She clung to him, burying her face in his shirt. "They are gone," he said. "For now." That night, the reality of their situation settled over the cabin like a shroud. There was no going back. The line had been crossed. They sat on the bed, fully clothed. Caleb had the rifle leaning against his knee. Nayland had a knife, his spare skinning knife, tucked into her belt. "The judge comes in 2 days," Caleb said. "We have to make it." "We will," Nayland said. "If we go to town." Caleb said. "We might not come back. You know that." "I know," she said. She leaned her head on his shoulder. "I'm not afraid of dying. Caleb, I'm afraid of living on my knees. Today, in the dark, I felt like an animal again. And I will not do that again." "No," Caleb said. He wrapped his arm around her, pulling her tight. "Never again." They lay down together, boots and all. The fire died down in the stove. Outside, the wind howled, a lonely, desolate sound. But inside, in the small warmth of the bed, 2 people held on to each other against the dark. Caleb listened to Nayland's breathing. He felt the rise and fall of her chest. He knew that in 48 hours, they would ride into the storm. He knew that blood would likely be spilled, but as he closed his eyes, he realized he was finally at peace. He had chosen his side. He had chosen her. And for the first time in his life, he knew exactly what he was fighting for. The air in Blackwater on the morning of the hearing was not merely hot, it was pressurized. The low clouds that had threatened rain for days had descended until they seemed to scrape the roofs of the false front buildings, turning the valley into a kiln. There was no wind. The dust sat heavy and still on the boardwalks, and the silence in the street was the kind that comes before a detonation. Rumors had moved faster than the telegraph wire. Men whispered in the livery stable and the barber shop that something was coming. They said Caleb Vance had lost his mind. They said the Apache witch had cast a spell on him. They said that, today, the judge, a circuit rider named Miller, who was known for his sour stomach and strict adherence to the letter of the law, would finally put an end to the nonsense. Caleb and Nayland arrived 2 hours before the sun. They rode in through the back trails, avoiding the main road where sentries might have been posted by the sheriff. Nayland wore a heavy wool shawl that smelled of mothballs, draped over her head to obscure her face, and a wide-brimmed felt hat that belonged to Caleb. She rode the mare while Caleb walked beside her, his hand resting on the animal's neck, his Winchester rifle in the crook of his arm. They tied the horse in the thicket of mesquite behind the community hall, a drafty structure of whitewashed clapboard that served as a church on Sundays and a courthouse when the law came to town. "Stay close," Caleb whispered. The darkness was thinning, turning a bruised purple in the east. "I am here," Nayland answered. Her voice was steady, but he could feel the vibration of her fear when he helped her down from the saddle. Her hand was cold in his. They slipped into the back of the hall just as the first gray light touched the windows. They sat in the shadows of the rear pew, waiting. By 8 in the morning, the hall was full. It smelled of unwashed bodies, tobacco chewed but not smoked, and the sour tang of anxiety. The entire town seemed to have squeezed into the pews. Women in bonnets sat with their hands folded tight in their laps, their eyes darting to the empty defendant's chair. Men stood along the back walls, arms crossed, pistols heavy on their hips. Silas Thorne sat in the front row. He wore his Sunday suit, the fabric straining across his massive shoulders, his face scrubbed pink, but his eyes hard as flint. Sheriff Webb stood near the judge's bench, looking nervous. His hand constantly adjusting his belt, Judge Miller banged his gavel. It sounded like a gunshot in the crowded room. "This court is in session," Miller croaked. He was a thin man with skin like parchment and eyes that had seen too much of the frontier's ugliness. "We have a docket to clear. Sheriff, bring the first matter." Before Webb could speak, Caleb Vance stood up from the back of the room. The sound of his boots on the floorboards was heavy and deliberate. He walked into the aisle, into the shaft of morning light that cut through the dust. "I have a matter for the court," Caleb announced. His voice was not loud, but it carried to every corner of the room. Heads turned. A murmur rippled through the crowd like wind through dry wheat. Thorne twisted in his seat, his neck turning a violent shade of red. "Vance," Thorne growled. "Sit down." "Judge," Caleb continued, ignoring Thorne, "I am here to present evidence of a crime committed by men in this room." Judge Miller peered over his spectacles. "This is not the time for grievances, Mr. Vance. If you have a complaint, file it with the clerk." "This cannot be filed," Caleb said. He turned and extended his hand toward the shadows of the back pew. "Come out, Nalin." Nayland stood. She walked down the aisle, her movements fluid and silent. When she reached Caleb's side, she reached up and pulled the hat from her head. The shawl fell to her shoulders. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. A woman in the third row let out a small shriek and covered her child's eyes. Men cursed. There she stood, an Apache woman in a white man's court. Her black hair was braided tight, her face was thin, the cheekbones sharp as blades, and her eyes were dark, burning coals that swept across the faces of the crowd. She saw the men who had jeered at her. She saw the women who had turned their heads. "This is Nalin?" Caleb said. "2 weeks ago, I found her chained to the south fence line of the Thorne Ranch. She was left without water. She was left to the coyotes." "Liar!" Thorne shouted, jumping to his feet. "She is a hostile! She attacked my cattle! She is a threat to every decent Christian family in this valley!" "Sit down, Mr. Thorne!" the judge barked. He looked at Nalin, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Vance, you are bringing a serious accusation, and you are bringing a person who has no standing in this court." "She has standing as a human being," Caleb said, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. "And as a victim of attempted murder." "Murder?" Sheriff Webb laughed nervously. "Nobody died. Caleb, she is standing right there. Only because I cut her loose," Caleb said. He looked at Nalin. "Tell him." Nayland stepped forward. She looked small in front of the high bench, but she did not shrink. She looked at the judge. "He put iron on me," she said. Her English was broken, the words rough stones in her mouth. She held up her wrists. The room went silent. The scars were vividly clear, rings of white and pink flesh where the cuffs had eaten into her skin. Dr. Morales, the town's physician who often treated the Mexican laborers, stood up from the middle rows. "I speak her tongue, Judge, a little. May I translate?" The judge hesitated, then nodded. "Proceed." Nayland spoke then, in her own language. Her voice started low, a whisper of wind in the sage, but it grew stronger. She spoke of the rope. She spoke of the dragging. She spoke of the laughter. Dr. Morales translated, his voice somber. "She says 3 men took her. She says they burned her with cigars. She says they told her to scream so they could feel big. She says they chained her to the wood and told her to pray to her pagan gods because no one else was coming." Nayland reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out a heavy, rusted object. It was a length of chain with a broken padlock hasp. She slammed it onto the judge's desk. The metal rang out, a harsh, undeniable sound of truth. "This was my jewelry," she said in English, staring directly at Silas Thorne. Thorne went pale, then purple. "She stole that! She stole it from my barn! She is a thief and a whore!" "Order!" Judge Miller hammered the gavel. "Order in this court!" "She is lying!" Thorne roared, pointing a shaking finger. "Look at her! She is a savage! She killed the Miller calves! She is planning a raid right now!" "The only savage in this room is wearing a Sunday suit," Caleb shouted back. The room erupted. Men were shouting, standing on pews. Accusations flew like stones. "Hang her," someone yelled from the back. "String them both up." Nayland stood in the center of the chaos, her hands trembling. She looked at the faces, contorted with hate, with fear, and some, just a few, flushed with deep, burning shame. She saw Mrs. Halloway looking down at her hands, weeping silently. "Recess," the judge bellowed, his face red. "Recess for 1 hour." "Sheriff, clear this hall. I want order." Sheriff Webb, looking relieved to have an excuse to move, began shoving people toward the doors. "You heard the judge? Out. Everyone out." Caleb grabbed Nayland's arm and pulled her toward the small anteroom behind the judge's bench. He kicked the door shut and slid the bolt home. The room was a dusty closet filled with old hymnals and broken chairs. The noise of the crowd outside was a muffled roar, like the ocean in a storm. Nayland collapsed against the wall. Her knees gave way, and she slid down until she was sitting on the floor, her arms wrapped around herself. She was shaking so violently, her teeth clicked together. "Nalin," Caleb said. He dropped to his knees beside her. She looked at him, her eyes wide and swimming with panic. "They hate," she whispered. "They hate so much. I saw their eyes. Caleb, they want to eat me." "I know," Caleb said. He pulled her into his arms. He held her tight, rocking her back and forth. "I know. But you did it. You told them. You made them look at the chain." "It does not matter," she sobbed into his chest. "They do not see the chain. They see only the skin." Caleb felt a rage so hot it nearly blinded him. He wanted to go back out there and empty his rifle into the crowd. He wanted to burn the town down. But he held her, stroking her hair with a trembling hand. "We are leaving," he said. "As soon as the judge comes back, we are riding out. I do not care what he says." "They will not let us," Nalin said. She pulled back, looking at his face. "Listen to them." Outside, the mood was shifting. It was no longer just noise. It was a chant. "Justice! Justice! Justice!" Silas Thorne and Sheriff Webb were on the steps of the hall. Thorne had a bottle in his hand. "Are we going to let a savage dictate the law to us?" Thorne shouted to the gathering mob. "Are we going to let a traitor like Caleb Vance spit on our town?" "No!" the crowd roared back. "She is guilty!" Thorne yelled. "We don't need a judge to tell us what to do with a wolf. We know what to do with wolves." The sun was beginning to dip, casting long, blood-red shadows across the street. Lanterns were being lit, though it was not yet dark. The flames bobbed like angry fireflies. Inside the anteroom, Caleb checked the load in his revolver. He had 6 shots. The rifle had 10. It was not enough. "Stay behind me," he told Nalin. "When we open this door, we move fast." Before they could move, the sound of the crowd changed. The chanting stopped abruptly. A different sound cut through the evening air, the sharp crack of rifles. Not 1 or 2, but a volley. Glass shattered in the main hall. A woman screamed. "What is that?" Nalin asked. She stood up, her head cocked. "Gunfire," Caleb said. "From the street." He moved to the small window and peered out through the grime. At the far end of the street, silhouetted against the dying light, was a line of riders. They were not townsmen. They sat on painted ponies, holding lever-action rifles high. They wore no shirts, only vests and ammunition belts. Their hair was long and loose. "Apache," Caleb whispered. Nayland pushed past him to look. She gasped. "Dasan!" It was her brother. He had come. The town was in chaos. Men were scrambling for cover behind rain barrels and watering troughs. Thorne and Webb stood in the middle of the street, stunned. "It is a raid!" Webb screamed. "Defend the town! Shoot them all!" "No!" Nalin screamed. She fumbled with the bolt on the door, her fingers slick with sweat. "Nalin, wait!" Caleb grabbed for her, but she had the door open. She ran out into the main hall, which was now empty save for the judge who was cowering behind his bench. She burst through the front doors and out onto the steps. "Stop!" she screamed in Apache. "Dasan, stop!" Caleb was right behind her. He saw the scene unfold in slow motion. There were 12 Apache warriors. They were dust-covered and grim. Dasan sat on a roan stallion in the center. He raised his hand, and his men held their fire. "Nalin," Dasan shouted. His face was a mask of fury and relief. "Come to me! We will burn this place for what they did!" Nalin ran down the steps into the dirt street. She stood between the mob of townsmen and the line of warriors. "No burning," she shouted. "No more blood! I am alive! Dasan, I am free!" Dasan looked at her. Then he looked at Caleb, who had stepped up beside her, his rifle held across his chest. Dasan's lip curled in disgust. "You stand with him?" Dasan spat. "With the white soldier? He is the one who hunts us. He is the one who saved me," Nalin cried. "He cut the chain. Dasan, he bled for me." Silas Thorne, who had taken cover behind a wagon wheel, saw his chance. The Apache were distracted. The woman was in the open. "Die, you witch!" Thorne roared. He stood up, leveling his heavy buffalo gun. Caleb saw the movement. He did not think. He did not calculate. He simply moved. He threw himself in front of Nalin just as the boom of the heavy rifle tore the air. The bullet caught Caleb in the side, spinning him around. It felt like being hit by a sledgehammer. He grunted and went down, hitting the dust hard. "Caleb!" Nalin screamed. She dropped to her knees beside him, her hands pressing over the wound. From the other end of the street, a rifle cracked. It was a clean, sharp sound. Silas Thorne jerked backward as if kicked by a mule. A neat, dark hole appeared in the center of his forehead. He collapsed into the dirt, the buffalo gun clattering from his dead hands. Dasan lowered his smoking rifle. He stared at the dead rancher with cold satisfaction. For a moment, the world stopped. The loudest man in town was dead. The silence was absolute, save for the wind and Nalin's sobbing. Then Sheriff Webb, panic overriding his senses, raised his pistol. He was shaking. He saw the Apache warriors. He saw Thorne dead, and he saw his own authority evaporating. "You killed him!" Webb shrieked. "You murdering savages!" He fired blindly into the group of Apaches. The bullet did not hit Dasan. It hit the boy next to him, a young warrior, barely 16, who sat tall on his pony. The boy slumped forward, sliding slowly off his horse to the ground. "Cale!" Nalin screamed. The sound tore out of her throat, a raw, jagged sound of pure heartbreak. It was not a scream of fear, but of loss so profound it echoed off the false fronts of the buildings. It was the sound of a mother losing a child, a sister losing a brother. The young warrior lay still in the dust, a dark stain spreading on his chest. The sheriff stood frozen, the smoking pistol in his hand. He looked at the boy he had just killed. He looked at the warriors who were now raising their rifles, their eyes filled with a promise of a massacre. "Stop!" Judge Miller walked out onto the porch. He was trembling, but he held his hands up high. "Enough!" the judge shouted. "Sheriff, drop that gun, or I will see you hanged for murder myself!" Webb looked at the judge, then at the Apaches. The gun slipped from his fingers and fell into the dirt. "This ends now," the judge declared, his voice cracking. "There has been enough death today." He looked at Dasan. He looked at the dead boy. He looked at Nalin, who was rocking back and forth between her wounded lover and her dead kin. "Take your dead," the judge said to the Apaches. "Take them and go. No one will follow you." Dasan looked at the judge. Then he looked at Webb. "That one," Dasan said, pointing his rifle at the sheriff. "He owes a life. The law will deal with him," the judge said. "I swear it on my life. He will face a federal court. If you kill him now, the army will come, and they will not stop until your people are gone. Go, please." Dasan stared at Webb for a long, terrifying minute. Webb fell to his knees, weeping. Finally, Dasan spat on the ground. He signaled to his men. 2 warriors dismounted and gently lifted the body of the boy, Cale, onto a horse. Dasan rode forward until he was 10 feet from where Nalin knelt in the bloody dust. Caleb was conscious, his face gray, clutching his side. "Nalin," Dasan said, "come, we leave this cursed place." Nalin looked up. Her face was streaked with tears and dust. She looked at her brother. The only family she had left. She looked at the body of Cale. Then she looked down at Caleb. Caleb's eyes were open. He was breathing in shallow gasps. He tried to push her away. "Go," he wheezed. "Go with them. You will be safe." Nayland looked at his hand. The hand that had cut the chain. She looked at the blood seeping through his fingers. Blood spilled to save her life. She looked back at Dasan. "No," she said. Dasan's face hardened. "He is white. He is the enemy. You choose him over your own blood? He is my blood now," Nayland said softly. "He stood when no one else stood. I stay." Dasan stared at her. The rejection cut deeper than a knife. "Then you are dead to us," he said coldly. "Do not follow. Do not seek us. You have chosen your cage." He yanked his horse's head around. "Ride." The Apache band turned and galloped out of town. The body of the boy strapped to a pony, disappearing into the gathering dark. Nayland did not watch them go. She bent over Caleb, tearing her skirt to make a bandage. "You fool," Caleb whispered, a tear leaking from his eye. "You should have gone." "Hush," Nayland said, pressing the cloth to his wound. "You talk too much." Around them, the townspeople began to emerge from their hiding spots. They looked at the dead body of Silas Thorne. They looked at the weeping sheriff. And they looked at the Apache woman tending to the wounded rancher in the middle of their street. There were no more slurs, no more shouts. The sheer weight of the tragedy had crushed the hate out of them, leaving only a hollow, aching silence. Judge Miller walked down the steps. He stood over them. "Is he alive?" the judge asked. "He lives," Nayland said fiercely. "He is strong. Get him to the doctor." The judge ordered the bystanders. "Pick him up, gently." 4 men rushed forward. They lifted Caleb with surprising care. "What about her?" "Mrs. Holloway asked, stepping forward. Is she free?" The judge looked at Nayland. He saw the defiance in her posture. He saw the truth that had been laid bare in blood. "There is insufficient evidence to hold her," the judge announced loudly, his voice echoing in the street. "The matter is dismissed. She is free to go." He turned to the sheriff, who was still kneeling in the dirt. "Sheriff Webb, you are under arrest for the murder of that boy. Get his badge." Nayland walked beside the men carrying Caleb. She did not look at the judge. She did not look at the town. She kept her hand on Caleb's shoulder, her eyes fixed on his face. She was an outcast to her people. She was a pariah to the whites. She had no tribe, no family, no home but the high desert wind. But as Caleb squeezed her hand, weak but steady, she knew she was not alone. She had made her choice. And as the first stars appeared over the bloody street of Blackwater, she knew she would make it again. The high desert winter did not arrive with a whisper. It arrived with the subtlety of a hammer blow. The wind shifted from the dry, oven-hot breath of the south to a biting, iron-tasting gale from the north, stripping the cottonwoods of their last yellow leaves and leaving the branches standing like skeletal fingers against the gray slate of the sky. 3 months had passed since the gunfire in the streets of Blackwater. The land itself had not changed. It was still a harsh, unforgiving expanse of scrub and stone, where the horizon was a flat line that seemed to go on forever. The dust devils still spun their lonely dances across the flats, and the coyotes still sang their hungry songs to the moon. But the ranch, huddled in the lee of the red bluffs, felt different. It was no longer a place of waiting. It was a place of living. Caleb Vance moved slower these days. The bullet from Silas Thorne's buffalo gun had taken a piece of him that would never grow back. It had missed the vitals, Dr. Morales said, but it had shattered a rib and torn through muscle that had been tight and strong since his youth. He walked with a hitch in his stride now, a permanent list to the left, favoring the side where the scar tissue pulled tight against his ribs on cold mornings. But he was out in the dawn light, pitchfork in hand, tossing hay to the small herd of cattle that had survived the drought. The animals were thicker now, their winter coats shaggy and dark. Nayland was there before him. She was breaking the ice on the water trough with the handle of an axe. She wore a coat Caleb had bought for her from the catalog, A heavy wool garment dyed a deep crimson, belted at the waist. Her hair was braided tight, dark ropes against the red wool. She looked up as he approached, her breath pluming in the frigid air. "You are late," she said. There was no malice in it, only the easy rhythm of a shared life. The cold gets into the bone. Caleb grunted, leaning on the pitchfork. "Takes a minute to thaw the engine. The engine is old," Nolan teased, a small smile touching the corners of her mouth. "Maybe we trade it for a mule. A mule would eat less." Caleb agreed. He watched her work. She moved with a strength that had returned tenfold since the days of the fever. Her hands, once torn and bloody from the iron cuffs, were now calloused and sure. She swung the axe handle with precision, shattering the sheet of ice so the cattle could drink. They worked in silence for the next hour. It was a companionable silence, filled with the sounds of chewing cattle, the crunch of boots on frozen mud, and the distant whistle of the wind. They were a team now, bound not just by the trauma of the past, but by the necessity of the present. The town of Blackwater was still there, 15 miles south, but it felt farther away than before. The distance was measured in more than miles. Caleb still rode in for supplies, but he went armed, and he did not linger. The atmosphere in town had shifted from open hostility to a strange, fearful avoidance. The death of Silas Thorne and the arrest of Sheriff Webb had broken the back of the town's aggressive racism, but it had not replaced it with love. Instead, gossip had filled the vacuum. Men in the saloon whispered that Nayland was a witch who had summoned a demon army to kill Thorne. Women crossed the street when Caleb rode by, clutching their shawls tight. They called him the White Apache behind his hands. They said he had sold his soul to the heathen gods, but there were cracks in the ice. Mrs. Halloway, the widow who ran the inn, always made sure to wave from her porch. Dr. Morales rode out to the ranch every Sunday to check Caleb's wound, often bringing a jar of pickled peppers or a loaf of sweet bread. "They are afraid," Morales had told them one evening, sitting by the wood stove while Nayland poured coffee. "People hate what they fear, and they fear what they do not understand. You confuse them. You break their rules just by breathing. Let them be confused," Nayland had said, her voice hard. "I do not need their understanding. I need their distance." But the isolation was not total. It was a fortress they had built for two. As the weeks turned into months, the intimacy between them deepened, growing like a root system in hard soil, slow, unseen, but impossible to tear out. It was in the small moments. It was Nolan pushing a cup of coffee into Caleb's hand when his side ached too much to work. It was Caleb carving a small wooden bird for her, sanding the wings until they were smooth as glass, and leaving it on her pillow without a word. It was the evening spent by the fire, the wind howling outside, trying to find a way in. One night, after a day of mending the roof, they heated water on the stove for a bath. The copper tub was set in front of the hearth. Caleb sat on a stool, shirtless, the firelight casting the jagged scar on his side into high relief. Nayland stood behind him with a pitcher of warm water. "Head down," she murmured. He leaned forward. She poured the water over his hair, the heat soaking into his scalp, washing away the dust of the day. Her fingers worked the soap into a lather, massaging his temples, his neck, the tension points behind his ears. Caleb closed his eyes, letting out a long, ragged sigh. Her touch was firm, but incredibly gentle. It was a touch that remembered pain, but offered comfort. "Is the water too hot?" she asked. "No," he whispered. "It is perfect." She rinsed his hair, the water cascading down his back, tracing the line of his spine. She took a towel and dried him, her hands lingering on his shoulders. Caleb reached up and covered her hand with his own. He pulled it to his lips, kissing the knuckles that still bore the faint, white ring of a scar from the shackle. He turned on the stool to face her. The firelight danced in her dark eyes. There was no hesitation in her gaze now, no flinching. "Your turn," he said. He washed her hair with the same devotion. He traced the line of her jaw with his thumb. They did not speak of love. The word felt too small, too clean for what they had. What they had was a survival that had bloomed into desire. That night, the thunder rolled in from the mountains, a low, guttural growl that shook the cabin walls. In the past, the sound would have sent Nayland into a panic, triggering memories of artillery and raiding parties. But tonight, she lay in the narrow bed beside Caleb, her back pressed against his chest, his arm draped heavy and protective over her waist. She felt his heartbeat against her spine. It was slow and steady. "Just thunder," Caleb whispered into her hair, sensing her tense up. "Just the sky talking." "I know," she whispered back. She turned in his arms, pressing her face into the hollow of his neck. They held each other tightly, legs tangled together under the heavy quilts. The desire that flared between them was not a frantic, grasping thing. It was a slow burn, edged with a profound gratitude that they were warm, that they were breathing, that they were not alone in the dark. But the ghosts still walked. They came in the hours before dawn, when the mind was most vulnerable. Nayland would wake up gasping, her hands clawing at her throat. In her dreams, she was back on the fence. The iron was biting into her wrists. The men were laughing, their faces twisted into masks of demons, or worse. She saw the face of Kale, the boy who had died in the street. She saw her brother Dasan turning his back on her, riding away into the darkness, leaving her stranded between two worlds. Caleb had his own demons. He would thrash in his sleep, shouting orders that no one followed. He saw the village at Red Rock. He saw the smoke rising from the winter lodges. He saw the bodies in the snow. When the nightmares came, they did not turn away from each other. "I saw him," Nayland whispered one night, the sweat cooling on her skin. "I saw Cale. He had a hole in his chest. He looked at me and asked why I let him die." Caleb pulled her closer, stroking her back. "You did not let him die. Nayland, it was the bullet. It was the hate. My brother hates me," she said, her voice breaking. "He says I chose the cage." "You chose life," Caleb said fiercely. "And you chose me. If that is a cage, then I am in it with you." "And you?" she asked, touching his face in the dark. "What do you see?" "I see the fire," Caleb admitted, his voice rough. "I see the faces of the women we drove out. I see the uniform. I cannot take it off. Nayland, it is burned into my skin." "We carry them," Nayland said softly. "The dead. We carry them like stones in a sack, but we do not have to carry everything." 2 days later, on an evening when the wind had died down to a whisper, they made a fire outside the cabin. It was not a fire for warmth. It was a fire for cleansing. Caleb brought out the wooden box from under the bed. He set it on the ground near the flames. His hands trembled slightly as he opened the lid. Inside lay the blue wool jacket with the yellow trim. The sergeant's stripes were faded. The brass buttons were tarnished. It smelled of camphor and old blood. Nayland stood beside him, watching. She held something in her own hand, a single heavy link of rusted iron she had kept from the chain. "I wore this coat for 10 years, Caleb said, looking at the wool. "I thought it made me a man. I thought it made me honorable." "It is just wool," Nayland said. "The honor is in the man, not the coat." Caleb nodded. He lifted the jacket. For a moment, he hesitated, the weight of his history pressing down on him. Then, with a sudden, decisive movement, he threw it onto the fire. The dry wool caught instantly. The flames licked up the sleeves, curling the fabric, blackening the yellow trim. Smoke rose, thick and gray, spiraling up into the red sunset. Caleb watched it burn. He watched the brass buttons pop and melt. He watched his past turn to ash. "Your turn," he said. Nayland stepped forward. She looked at the iron link in her palm. It was cold and heavy. It was the symbol of her humiliation, the physical manifestation of the town's cruelty. "This is not me," she whispered. "This is just metal." She tossed the link into the heart of the fire. It did not burn, of course, but it blackened. It sat in the coals, glowing angry red, then turning dark as the fire consumed the wood around it. It was no longer a shackle. It was just debris. They stood there until the fire died down, watching the smoke carry their ghosts away into the vast, indifferent sky. A week later, they saddled the horses and rode out. It was a long ride, nearly 20 miles to the north, to the rocky canyon where the Apache band had retreated after the shooting. Nalin knew where they would have buried their dead. It was a traditional place, a high crevice in the rocks facing the rising sun. They found the cairn of stones by midday. It was simple, unmarked save for a few prayer feathers tied to a sagebrush branch nearby. Nalin dismounted and walked to the pile of stones. She did not weep. She stood tall, her hands at her sides. Caleb stood 20 paces back, holding the horses. He took off his hat, the wind ruffling his gray-streaked hair. He did not belong in this circle of grief. He knew that. He was the reason the boy was dead, in a way. But he stood witness. He stood guard. Nalin began to sing. It was a low, trembling sound that seemed to rise up from the earth itself. The words were in her tongue, rising and falling in a minor key that spoke of sorrow deeper than oceans. She sang for Cale. She sang for her brother's anger. She sang for the family she had lost and the world that had been stolen from them. Caleb understood none of the words, but he understood the melody. It was the universal language of loss. It tore at his heart. When she was finished, she placed a smooth river stone on the cairn. She turned and walked back to him. Her face was dry, but her eyes were clear. "It is done," she said. On the ride back, the sun began to dip, painting the desert in hues of violet and gold. They were 5 miles from the ranch when they saw a wagon coming down the trail. It was a settler family, likely heading for the town to trade. A man drove the team. A woman sat beside him, and 2 children peered out from the back under the canvas cover. Caleb tensed. He moved his horse closer to Nalin's, his hand drifting near his rifle. Old habits died hard. The wagon slowed as they passed. The settler, a man with a beard full of dust, stared openly. He looked at Caleb, a white man with a scar on his face. He looked at Nalin, an Apache woman riding astride, wearing a white man's coat but with her hair in braids. The settler's face twisted in confusion and a flicker of scorn. He spat over the side of the wagon and slapped the reins, urging the team faster. His wife turned her head away, shielding her face as if from a bad smell. But in the back of the wagon, a small girl, no older than 6, poked her head out. She had bright blue eyes and hair the color of corn silk. She did not look away. She stared at Nalin with wide, unblinking curiosity. There was no hate in her eyes, no judgment, just simple wonder at the sight of the woman on the horse. Nalin saw the girl. For a second, their eyes locked. Nalin raised a hand and gave a small, hesitant wave. The little girl smiled, a gap-toothed, brilliant smile, and waved back. The wagon rattled on, disappearing into the dust. Nalin let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Did you see?" she asked. "I saw the father spit," Caleb muttered. "No," Nalin said, shaking her head. "The child. She waved. She is young," Caleb said. "She has not learned to hate yet. That is the hope," Nalin said quietly, "that they do not learn." That evening, they sat at the rough table, picking at a dinner of cornbread and beans. The encounter on the road hung between them. "We could leave," Caleb said suddenly. "We could sell the cattle, pack the mules, go north to Canada, or south to Mexico. There are places where people might not care as much." Nalin chewed slowly. "Considering, is there such a place? Or are we just trading one set of eyes for another?" "I worry," Caleb admitted. "I worry that here, you will always be the savage to them. You will never be Nalin. You will be a story they tell to scare children. And I worry," Nalin said, "that if we go to my people, you will always be the blue coat. You will be the enemy who stole me." She reached across the table and took his hand. "We are between worlds. Caleb, we do not fit in the town. We do not fit in the tribe. So we are exiles," Caleb said heavily. "No," Nalin said. "We are the bridge." She looked around the cabin. It was small, it was rough, but the fire was warm, and the walls were strong. "We stay," she said firmly. "This is our land. We bled for it. We stay here. And we build something different." "Different how?" "There are others," Nayland said. "Others like us. The Mexican families who are treated like dirt. The mixed-blood children who have no tribe. The men who put down their guns and don't know how to pick up a plow. We make this place for them." Caleb looked at her. He saw the vision in her eyes. It was a hard road. It would mean constant vigilance. It would mean being outcasts. But it was a purpose. "A sanctuary," Caleb said. "For the strays. For the free," Nayland corrected. On the final evening of the year, the air was crisp and smelled of coming snow. They sat on the porch bench, watching the sun die behind the western peaks. The sky was a bruising canopy of purple and gold, bleeding into the deep indigo of night. Caleb sat with his legs stretched out, his bad side aching slightly in the cold, but it was a familiar pain now, one he could live with. Nayland sat beside him, her head resting on his shoulder. His arm was around her waist, pulling her into the warmth of his coat. His fingers traced slow, absent-minded patterns on the back of her hand, the hand that had once been chained, now holding his. "Do you remember?" Caleb asked softly. "The first day, at the fence." "I remember," Nayland said. She did not flinch at the memory anymore. "You said, 'Do whatever you want,'" Caleb recalled. "You looked like you were waiting for the end of the world." "I was," Nayland said. "I thought you were death coming for me." Caleb turned his head to kiss the top of her head. "When you said that, it broke something in me. I realized that what I wanted wasn't to own you. I didn't want your submission. Nayland, I wanted your freedom. I wanted you to be able to say no." Nayland smiled against his shoulder. It was a small, private smile. "You gave me the knife to cut the rope," she said. "But that day, the day you freed me, Caleb, that was the day you chained yourself to me instead." Caleb chuckled, a low rumble in his chest. "I suppose I did." "By choice," she added. "That is the difference. The iron is heavy only if you do not choose to carry it." They fell silent, watching the horizon, far off, miles away over the dark plains. Lightning flickered in a bank of clouds. A winter storm was coming. It would be hard. The snow would drift high, the wind would howl, and the cattle would need tending in the freezing dark. There would be danger. There would be men who hated them. There would be hard years ahead. But as Caleb watched the storm approach, he felt no fear. He felt the solid weight of the woman beside him. He felt the beat of his own heart, strong and steady. "Let it come," he whispered to the wind. "We are ready," Nayland answered. They sat there together, two scarred souls on the edge of the world, watching the darkness roll in, armed with nothing but a stubborn, defiant, and terrifyingly beautiful love. Thank you for listening to this story. I hope Caleb and Ullin's journey resonated with you. It has been a privilege to bring this tale of resilience and connection to life. I would love to hear from you. Please leave a comment letting me know where you are listening from and what you thought of the ending. Did Nayland and Caleb make the right choice to stay? If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to From Wild West for more tales of the frontier, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support keeps these stories alive.